I'm Bill Bullard, CEO of R-CALF USA, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'd like to, this evening, talk about the state of your cattle industry. And I want to bring up something very important at the beginning and then very important at the end. And then we're going to talk about what we view to be a tremendous threat facing our industry as a result of this crisis. So as we know today, we're facing the most serious crisis that our industry has ever faced in recent memory, if ever. And we know that people are hurting. And we know that we have to come up with a solution. And we know that Congress is getting differing signals from industry representatives. So is the White House. And when that happens, the easiest thing for Congress and other government officials to do is to simply throw money at the problem and then do nothing. Unfortunately, the money's going to run out, but the situation is so severe that it's likely to be prolonged. And so we have to do something about it. Now, R-CALF USA and NCBA are the two major organizations representing the cattle industry. We compete on a regular basis over our very differing views. We have to put that aside right now. Our respective organizations have an absolute obligation to preserve the economic viability of every cattle producer out there. And we're facing a situation like we've never faced before. And if you're an NCBA member or an NCBA officer, you know our positions. We've been very public about it. We don't know yours yet. What we need to do is find common ground. We need to find a solution, even if it's just a stopgap solution. But we need to find a solution that will enable our independent producers all across the United States to survive through this crisis and then to prosper when this crisis is over. And so at this point, we look at what has been done, what has been offered, other than what we've offered. We see that there's been a request for an investigation. But when your industry is collapsing around you, an investigation is woefully inadequate. We have to come up with solutions. And there's been many producer members who have called us with a variety of solutions, ranging from using a different index to calculate formula prices, tying cash prices to the wholesale beef prices, freezing the wholesale beef prices, or even putting a collar around a variation up or down from the wholesale beef prices that would provide at least some more stability in this volatile situation we're facing tonight, as well as putting a stop on imports, a temporary hold on imports. There are a number of solutions out there that we haven't addressed, haven't carried forward. And so there's plenty of solutions that we could be working on that may well help in this situation. So if you are an NCBA member or officer, I would hope that you'll carry this to your board. R-CALF Board of Directors is willing to work with you. We can meet somewhere for the sole purpose of finding common ground to find a real meaningful solution for cattle producers today. And when we get over this crisis, we can go back to being competing organizations. But right now, our industry has to come together because Congress is looking for answers, the White House is looking for answers, and they don't know what they are. And that's our responsibility as representatives of the cattle industry. So tonight, as I walk through this presentation, what I want to identify are the factors that have contributed to the collapse of our marketplace and the ongoing dysfunction of the marketplace. And so everybody should be watching this very closely and deciding as we go along whether there are some of those factors that deserve a solution that has not yet been offered, because we need to be considering these solutions. So what I want to do is go right to our slides here, if this will work tonight. Oh, here we go. So I hope you can see this first slide. And so what I want to do is describe what our cattle industry looks like today. And we can do that looking at this slide. You can consider the cattle industry as a pyramid. And at the base, we have a little over 750,000 independent cattle producers scattered across the United States. They're all producing about 25 to 26 million live animals that are produced specifically to go to the feed yard. So these are your fed heifers and steers that are being produced by our cow-calf producers. So as you go to the top of the pyramid, you begin to see a bottleneck. The first bottleneck is the first black line here, And that represents the small farmer feeders that we have the most of. We still have about 26,000 farmer feeders left, but they only feed about 13% of those 26 million cattle. And then as we move further up to the pyramid and the bottleneck tightens even further, there we have just a little over 2,100 large to very large cattle feedlots. And they feed about 87% of those 25 to 26 million head of cattle. And so then we run into the serious bottleneck, and that's at the top of the pyramid when these 25, 26 million head of cattle are sold to the packers. There's only 4 packers controlling 85% of those cattle. And so our industry is highly concentrated. In fact, it's probably among the most highly concentrated industries in the United States. And as you look at this pyramid visually, it looks rather robust. But this pyramid represents a steep decline in the number of independent cattle producers that used to be here at the base. Just half a lifetime ago, we had 500,000 more. In other words, we've lost over 500,000 cattle producers from this industry. But that was since 1980. And in the past 20 years, we've lost a lot of cattle producers too. And we've lost tens of thousands of these smaller feedlots here where the bottleneck just begins. So there's the condition of our industry today visually. And now let's look at what's happened over the past decade or so. And what I'm showing you is a relationship between fed cattle prices, and that's the red line beginning in July of 2009. And the red line represents cattle price increases. And then here at the top is the November 2014, after which cattle prices collapsed. These are fed cattle prices. They collapsed clear down to October of 2016. And then they began a recovery, but then they inexplicably fell again. And they tried to recover again. And what you're seeing here is each subsequent peak is lower than the previous peak. And that represents a downward trend from 2017 on through today. Now, this only goes to March of 2020 because it's the latest data available. You know, this red line is going to be way down here when I'm able to update it. So there's your fed cattle prices. And now the relationship between those prices and the price that consumers pay for beef. So what we're looking at with the blue graph is beef retail prices. This is all fresh beef. And we see that as cattle prices began to increase after the recessionary period of 2008 and 9, cattle prices were trending upward. And as the blue graph represents, retail prices were keeping pace with the escalating fed cattle prices. And then in November of 2014, after which cattle prices suddenly collapsed and retail beef prices kept climbing for another 8 months. And then they fell somewhat. And before 2017, they hit their historic low over the past 5 years. But then we see from that point forward that the retail beef prices have been steadily climbing. In fact, we see a significant upward trend. So we have an upward trend in beef prices and a downward trend in cattle prices, and the spread in between is the widest in history. So obviously the COVID pandemic did not cause this. That occurred in late February and March of 2020. Instead, this has been a systemic problem for the past 5 years. So keep this chart in mind as we move ahead, because what I want to show now is what happened in addition to the actions that we were experiencing today. Well, let me back up. I apologize for this. I want to go to the next chart and just highlight some important dates. So here we had cattle prices rising after the recession with retail prices catching up, and then suddenly an inexplicable collapse, the first one. That's actually the longest and deepest collapse in cattle prices we've seen in our history. And right here in January of 2016 is when RCAF sought an investigation from the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. So we asked for an investigation to determine what could have caused this inexplicable collapse in cattle prices there in early January 2015. And so the investigation we requested was ongoing through 2018. And then we get to September of 2018 right here. having had no enforcement action taken by the government throughout this period, that cattle markets were unexplainably volatile, here we made our second request for an investigation, and that was with the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And so we've made two requests for investigation during this period with no plausible explanation as to why this was occurring. And then in April of 2019, over a year ago today, is when we decided that it was clear the government wasn't going to take action, the regulators weren't taking action. So that is when the membership of R-CALF stepped to the plate and filed the historic antitrust lawsuit, alleging that the primary cause of this anomaly within our marketplace, as we state in our complaint, we allege that this was because of collusion. We allege that the four largest meat packers have colluded in order to drive domestic cattle prices down while increasing their own margins and profits. So that occurred in April of 2019. And then about in here is when the Holcomb fire occurred in Kansas. And then there was a renewed call for investigations, this time by the government. And as you know, that investigation has been ongoing throughout this cycle. And here we are in January of 2020, after which we've seen yet another inexplicable collapse in our cattle prices. So for a historical basis and a summary background, that's what we've recognized as a serious, serious problem in the industry. And we realize and believe firmly that the most serious problem we have is that of antitrust violations and anti-competitive activity that we have alleged in our lawsuit. But regardless of that, lawsuits take a long time. And so we have to look at what other factors might have contributed to this sudden and inexplicable collapse in cattle prices. And one thing we note is that based on USDA data, what we're looking at here now is for the same time period. So this is, we started in 2009, 10 and go all the way through 2020. So this is the same time period. We start in 2010, and this represents the beef imports that the United States imports from about 20 different countries. And what I did was I highlighted this section right here, because throughout this 10-year period, you saw that imports were increasing in volume coming into the United States. And then suddenly, beginning in February of 2014, we saw an explosion in imports coming to the United States. In fact, during this period, we quadrupled the imports of beef from Australia. And so this represents a shock to the system. And that shock was a sudden influx of large volumes of imports coming into this country. And then after August of 2015, they just kind of leveled off and continued trending upward based on the same trajectory that they were already on. And so as we look at that and then compare that period to the cattle prices, we see here in February of 2014, when those imports exploded, we were increasing significantly the volume of imports as our cattle prices were increasing. And then as they were decreasing with these additional imports, and then after that period, of course, the market appears to be significantly broken and then has remained dysfunctional ever since. So it appears that there was a strategy here in order to limit the increases in cattle prices and then perhaps to control cattle prices. But the facts show that we had a significant increase in imports from around the world during this period. But there was something else occurring as these cattle prices were steadily increasing. Again, for a variety of reasons. The principal one, of course, is that the recession of 2008 and 9 were over. And we've had some droughts during this period that shortened the supply of cattle. And we've had other factors occurring. But one measurable factor is looking at the cash market itself. And I've shown this graph before, but what this graph represents is the weekly volume of cattle that the meat packers purchase in the competitive cash market. And of course, that's our price discovery market. This is the market at the fed cattle to the packer stage at the top of that pyramid, where we have this tremendous bottleneck. So we go back, clear back to 2002, and we see that in the early 2000s, we had the cash volume was up 60%, 50%. Here's 40% down here. So the cash volume at this time meant that the majority, over 50% of the cattle were being sold and negotiated in a competitive cash market. And then these cattle are maintaining or establishing the base price for the other 40 to 50% of cattle that the meat packers had committed to them through captive supplies, but that's they committed those cattle before they were available for any kind of price discovery. So we see the relationship here between fed cattle prices, that's the orange line. Again, we hit 2009, which was the beginning of the other chart, and we see cattle prices trending upwards. But while these cattle prices were trending upward and while the imports were increasing here, we also see a marked reduction in the volume of cattle being sold in our price discovery market. So here in 2011 and 12, we had about the 30% level, and that meant that only 30% of the cattle were setting the base price for 70% or so of the formula cattle that were committed to the meat packer without ever being able to serve the function of price discovery. And then as these cattle prices continue to increase, we see that our cash market was growing razor thin. And the red line here represents January 1 of 2015. That happens to be the period of our antitrust lawsuit. So when cattle prices broke in late 2014 and started their collapse all the way through 2016, we see that during that period, we had some historically low volumes of cattle sold in the cash market. And then after the cattle price broke, we see that we are still well below, ranging, actually the average is around 24% in the cash market for this 5-year period. And then if you add the 4% of negotiated grid cattle, you're up around 28%. So we're up around 26 to 28 to 30% through this period. And during this period, of course, we had this volatility that's unexplainable in our cattle industry. So it's clear to us, based on USDA data, that there was two factors that were contributing to the dysfunction of your cattle market. And they include that anomaly, the huge increase in imports during the time that cattle prices were climbing. And then at the time cattle prices were climbing, we saw a significant reduction. So what had to have happened here is that the meat packers were enticing people who would normally sell in the cash market to enter into formula contracts. The only reason producers would do that, knowing how important it is to maintain a robust competitive price discovery market, is if there was a financial incentive or some other incentive. And we've argued in the past that one of the big incentives was having timely access to the marketplace, because when you have 4 packers controlling 85% of the market, there's considerable market access risk within the industry. And studies show that producers were willing to trade the price for the ability to timely market cattle. So clearly this was an action being taken at the time your cattle prices were increasing. And then after the cattle prices collapsed and remained volatile, we see that we're now at a very reduced level of the volume in the cash market. So the next chart is the one where we announced this meeting and said we were going to provide a warning to the industry. And here it is. And what this is a call to action. It's a call to every organization out there to begin studying this to determine whether or not our initial thoughts on this are correct. If we look at the hog industry, everyone remembers, or we talked to our fathers or grandfathers, and knew that not in the far too distant past, in 1998, we had a collapse of the hog price in the hog market. And the hog prices fell. There's reports of $15 a hundredweight to $10 a hundredweight to 8-cent hogs. So that happened in 1998, and we did some research and found that during 1998 and just prior, we had reduced slaughter access. We've reduced slaughter capacity in the hog industry by 8%. And we, in the same time in 1998, we increased hog production by 10%. And at the same time in 1998, we imported a million more feeder pigs into the United States. And so those three factors contributed to the collapse in the hog market. But what was significant there is leading up to 1998, there was an effort to bring more and more hog producers under production contracts and formula contracts. And the way that that was done, of course, is there was a price incentive and an access incentive. And so the producers who remained in the cash market, many went broke. The producers who remained in those formula contracts became completely vertically integrated and controlled by the meat packer. Now, what I'm showing you here is not the hog industry. This is our industry. And this goes back from October of 2019, and it's showing the relationship between formula prices for cattle and cash prices for cattle. So the blue line represents cash cattle prices. So in October 2019, cash cattle prices were about $110. They increased to about $124 in January of 2020. And then we saw this inexplicable collapse in cash prices. And then we had a slight jump here. And I honestly don't know the reason for that. This is the USDA data, just raw data. And then we see cash prices just falling to the basement. Here in the last week, April 27th, we're under $100. And where is that going to go from here? We hope it subsides or quits at some point in its free fall. So there's the cash market. And here are the formula prices, the orange line, that are from everything that we've understood. These prices use the cash price for a base and then provide some financial incentive. What we're seeing is that the spread between the cash price and the formula prices is growing significantly. In fact, it appears this may be the widest spread in history. In other words, there's a better for the last 4 weeks. That spread has been better than $11 a hundredweight. So if you're a lender looking at a cattle farmer feeder, small to mid-sized cattle feeder, and the cattle feeder says, I want to operate in the cash market, what's the lender going to say to that borrower when they see that there's an $11 premium if they would just agree to commit all their cattle to the packer and not participate in the cash market? So what this is showing us is the potential for a clear disaster in our industry. The hog industry, in relatively speaking, was vertically integrated almost overnight. And our cattle industry is in such a precarious position today, with reports of about 500,000 or more fed cattle backed up because of slowdown packing, and reports that yearlings can't be sold. And so what is happening here is the question that I'm posing to the industry tonight, because as our board has looked at this, this appears to be the preliminary stages of vertically integrating the U.S. cattle industry from birth to plate. In other words, control, not ownership. This would be controlled by the multinational meat packers. So this is the warning for tonight, that we have a series of factors that are coalescing, suggesting to us that we are in deep trouble and that we need to take corrective actions immediately. And so we also looked since January 1 of 2020 as to what level of imports are coming into the United States at the time when we have cattle feeders who haven't received a bid for their cattle for 6 weeks or longer. And so here we have a chart showing the blue graph represents the weekly volume of imports crossing into the United States border. And here we have the weekly fed cattle prices from January 1, 2020 through the week ending April 17th, which is the last date available. There's a lag in being able to get the import numbers. So what I did to calculate the sheer volume of imports coming into the United States on a weekly basis is I converted the live cattle to the beef equivalent, just like your beef checkoff does. They determined that for every 592 pounds of imported beef, that represents one animal and they're assessed $1. And so that allowed us to do a comprehensive report on what the volume of imports were. So at the first of the year, you saw that the import volume on a weekly basis was relatively low, but increasing. And our cattle prices at this time were about $124 a hundredweight. And then the imports increased and kind of steadied here for a few weeks. And then we saw cattle prices starting to fall. And then we saw imports starting to rise. And then from March of 2020 to early April, or here, early April, we saw a 22% increase in the volume of imports that the United States importers and meat packers are bringing in. And what this is doing, it's displacing the American cattle producers' access to their own market. And in fact, while the meat packers are not offering bids for cash sellers and haven't for the past 4 or 5 weeks, we're importing thousands of head of cattle from Canada for slaughter. These are cattle being delivered for slaughter in US plants. This is wrong. We're in a crisis situation. We should be looking out for the US cattle producer, and the current policies that we're operating under are simply not doing that. And so at the beginning of the presentation tonight, I said that we are in the most serious crisis that any of us could probably ever remember. And this is not the time for the major cattle organizations, the NCBA and R-CALF USA, to be competing about the differing views we have for the future of our industry. Instead, we need to work together right now, and we need to work together to come up with meaningful solutions, even if they are stopgap solutions, even if there is something that will simply tide us over until we can resume the competition and decide what our industry is going to look like in the future. So tonight, I want to invite and request that the members and officers of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association work with us, sit down with us. We can sit privately. We'll have a handful of R-CALF USA board members, a handful of NCBA board members. Let's go through some of the good ideas that our respective organizations have received and come up with something that we can do for our industry right away. Now, that doesn't mean that R-CALF USA is going to back off at all on the proposals that we have already put forward and we will continue working on. What that means is we are willing to work with the NCBA to come up with a meaningful solution that will provide relief to cattle producers, because this government money is going to run out, and it's likely going to run out before we can resume normal operations of our live cattle supply chain. And so this has to be a priority. And so I hope that from this moment forward, we can begin seriously looking at these solutions so that we can bring to Congress and to the White House an immediate stopgap measure that will provide the relief that our respective members deserve. So with that, let me go stop the presentation. And so I don't see any questions or comments or anything on my screen. You know, folks, I'm a little lacking in my technical skills, and I don't see comments at this point, but we did say it was going to be a short meeting, so we've gone just under 30 minutes. And what we will do, as we've done in the past, is we'll reschedule and have another meeting quickly to address comments and concerns and suggestions that you have. And I'd like to take this moment, as I did before, to say, for those of you who have called us and emailed us and texted us, we've simply not been able to respond to everybody. We are currently researching, we are currently working with members of Congress, we are currently seeking solutions, and we just don't have the resources to be as responsive as we should be right now. during this crisis period. So if you've tried to contact us and have not received a response, please wait just a little bit and then contact us again. Those of you who are sending us written recommendations, we're reading them. We just don't have time to actually respond to each and every one of them. So God bless everyone out there. We wish we had a better solution tonight. We don't, but we'd better quit doing exactly what we're doing and find those solutions. And that's why we need to begin working together as an industry. And that's why I'm asking the NCBA to sit down with us and find a solution for our hardworking, honest, independent cattle producers all across the United States. So I did say that we would continue to fight for the issues that we've already put on the table while we continue to look for common ground. And of course, one of the most important is the petition that we've got circulating that now has nearly 300,000 consumers and producers who are together calling for the restoration of mandatory country of origin labeling for pork, beef, and for dairy products. And so we invite you to our website to join that petition at www.demandUSAbeef.com. That's www.demandUSAbeef.com. And for any consumers that may be out there, I also want to direct you to the website that we provided as a platform to connect consumers with beef producers who can sell beef directly to consumers. And that's at www.usabeef.org. Now, I know some NCBA organizations have set some of these up in their respective states, and we welcome that. We appreciate that. Our job has to be to preserve for our independent producers the opportunity to remain viable, economically viable through this crisis, as well as to continue providing the consumer the safest, most wholesome and nutritious beef in the world, and that's produced right here in the United States of America. So with that, God bless everyone out there. Thank you and good night.